The bitter wind cut through the thin, tattered uniforms, chilling the women to their bones. Frost crept along the edges of the wooden barracks, seeping into every crevice where the Nazis hadn't bothered to repair. Outside, the camp was silent, save for the occasional bark of a guard's orders, harsh and unyielding. Inside, fear was a constant companion. Every cough, every footstep beyond the fence sparked a moment of panic, a reminder that freedom was nothing more than a distant, unattainable dream. Marianne clutched her hands together, rubbing them raw against the cold, her eyes hollow from weeks without proper sleep or food. Across the room, Anna sat hunched over a small, worn notebook, scribbling letters she would never send. The women whispered quietly to one another, sharing fragments of memories, family, small joys, moments of innocence that felt like lives from another world. The walls of the barracks seemed to close in with every passing hour, every ticking second a reminder that they were prisoners not only of the camp, but of fear itself. Then, one morning, the air shifted. A distant clatter echoed through the camp, unusual for its abruptness, and a German officer appeared, his expression unreadable. "Women of this camp," he announced, voice echoing over the frozen yard, "you are to be transferred. You will leave Europe. You are free. To go to America." A stunned silence followed. "Free? America?" The words barely registered. Marianne's heart raced, caught between disbelief and hope. Years of terror and deprivation had dulled her ability to feel joy, and yet something fragile and trembling stirred inside her chest. Could it be true? Was freedom finally within reach? As the women were hurriedly prepared for departure, a mixture of emotions twisted through the air. Fear, disbelief, excitement, and anxiety all tangled together. They would leave the only world they had known, yet the world waiting for them was unknown, a foreign land where language, work, and survival awaited. None could say what challenges awaited, only that the promise of New York held both hope and uncertainty. As the train carried them across a continent scarred by war, the women pressed against the windows, eyes wide at forests and fields rushing past. Each mile a step closer to freedom, but also deeper into the unknown. The Atlantic Ocean would separate them from the life they once knew, and the factories of New York would demand more than they could yet imagine. For the first time in years, Marianne dared to hope, but the question lingered, heavy and unspoken. Freedom was one thing, but could they survive a world that had never expected them to exist outside a camp? The journey had begun, and with it the fragile, uncertain promise of a life beyond captivity. The first glimpse of New York City hit them like a thunderclap. From the train window, Marianne and the other women saw towering buildings that seemed to scrape the clouds, streets filled with roaring automobiles, and a mass of people flowing like rivers through the avenues. The city pulsed with life, even under the shadow of war, and for a moment the women were struck silent. Their eyes darted between neon signs and smoke-belching factories, struggling to take in the dizzying scale of the metropolis. For weeks, they had endured the monotony and terror of captivity, and now freedom crashed over them in a torrent of unfamiliar sounds and smells. The clamor of streetcars, the blaring of car horns, the chatter of people in a language some barely understood. It was overwhelming. Anna pressed her hands over her ears, while Marianne's jaw tightened. They had dreamed of freedom, but this was a world they had never imagined. As the train rattled into the station, their feet hit the platform with a tentative nervousness. The women clung to one another, each step a cautious exploration of the unknown. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of coal and smoke, and soldiers, workers, and civilians moved in purposeful chaos. Signs advertised rationed goods, and lines stretched around street corners for bread, meat, and coffee. The women watched, uncertain whether to join or stand back, feeling small and exposed in the swarm of American life. Then came their first encounter with the factory representatives. The women had expected grim military work details, chores, perhaps cleaning or menial labor. Instead, men in suits, briefcases in hand, approached with professional politeness, even warmth. "Welcome," one said, his voice firm but kind. We need skilled hands for the war effort. Your experience and dedication will be invaluable." The words stunned them. Skilled work. They had survived in camps with barely enough to keep alive, not polished for industrial production. Yet here they were, being offered a chance to contribute, to work in factories producing weapons, machinery, and supplies critical for the soldiers overseas. The promise of purpose mingled uneasily with the weight of expectation, creating a tense mixture of relief and anxiety. But the women quickly realized they were not universally welcomed. Among the bustling crowds, whispers followed them. Some locals stared, suspicious of these foreign arrivals, their unfamiliar accents and hesitant movements marking them as outsiders. Fellow workers in the factories eyed them warily, a mix of curiosity and skepticism in their gaze. "Can they really do the work?" a foreman muttered under his breath. "They don't belong here." Marianne felt a pang of unease. Freedom, yes, but acceptance. That was another battle entirely. She noticed the subtle tests, extra scrutiny of their movements, the guarded conversations, the sideways glances when they asked for instructions. Every small mistake seemed magnified, every hesitation noted. The women's internal conflict intensified. They were free from captivity, yet now faced the invisible bars of prejudice and expectation. The pressure to prove their worth in a society that viewed them as temporary strangers. Even daily life was a challenge. Learning the subway system felt like deciphering a foreign code. Understanding the complex schedule of ration cards, workplace shifts, and housing assignments demanded focus and patience they hadn't needed in the camps. Yet beneath the anxiety, there was a spark, an unfamiliar excitement at the possibility of being needed, of being useful, of carving out a life, however temporary, in a world that had seemed untouchable from the barbed wire fences of their past. By evening, the women were assigned to their first accommodations near the factories, a modest dormitory filled with other foreign workers. Exhaustion tugged at them, but sleep was elusive. Outside, the city lights glimmered, a constant reminder that life was moving at a pace they had never known. Marianne pressed her hands to the cold window pane, looking out at the skyline and the busy streets below. The factories awaited in the morning, and with them new challenges, new lessons, and the daunting task of proving themselves worthy in a world that had just opened its doors to them. As they drifted into a restless sleep, the question lingered in every mind: could they survive not only the physical demands of factory work, but the unspoken trials of acceptance in a city that was as foreign as it was promising? New York had welcomed them, but survival and recognition would be earned one day, one task, one interaction at a time. The city was alive with possibility, but with every shadowed alley and crowded street, the women sensed that freedom was just the beginning, not the end, of their journey. The morning fog hung low over the factory district, and the women approached the massive brick buildings with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Inside, the air was thick with heat, smoke, and the rhythmic clatter of machinery. Conveyor belts hummed like mechanical beasts, stamping metal and weaving parts in a precise, relentless cadence. For Marianne and the others, every sound was a shock, every machine a challenge they had never faced. "Stay close," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. "Watch and learn." The women lined up as a foreman barked instructions, pointing to gleaming machines and piles of materials. Their task was simple in theory: assemble, inspect, and package parts that would be shipped overseas to aid the war effort. But the pace was punishing. Quotas loomed over them like shadowy threats. Supervisors watched with hawk-like intensity, and the slightest misstep could draw sharp reprimands. Marianne's hands shook as she tried to adjust a lever on a press, fumbling with the unfamiliar mechanism. "Steady," a voice said behind her. She turned to see a young woman in a factory uniform, sleeves rolled up, moving with practiced ease. "I'm Lucy," she said, offering a small smile. "You'll get the hang of it. Just watch the rhythm, feel the machine, don't fight it." Lucy became their lifeline. She guided Marianne and the others through the first day, showing them shortcuts, correcting mistakes quietly and translating the occasional idiom that baffled the women. Her patience was a balm to their anxiety, a small beacon in the overwhelming chaos. Still, challenges persisted. Words twisted on tongues, English grammar tripping them up mid-sentence, miscommunications leading to accidental mistakes on the line. Marianne dropped a delicate gear, and a supervisor's sharp hand gesture made her flinch. Her cheeks burned with shame. Anna tried to encourage her, but even her own confidence wavered. Each day was a test, each moment a reminder that survival in captivity had not prepared them for this new kind of scrutiny. Yet amidst the tension, moments of camaraderie flourished. Lunchtimes became brief reprieves, filled with whispered stories, shared snacks and laughter that startled them with its normalcy. They exchanged small gifts, folded origami cranes, a piece of chocolate smuggled from rations, a hastily written letter in English. These tiny acts forged bonds, unspoken agreements that they were not alone in this unfamiliar world. But adaptation was not just physical, it was cultural. Marianne struggled to understand the casual conversations around her. Jokes, idioms, references to baseball, soda, and radio programs. A casual remark about putting your back into it left several women frozen, unsure if they had been scolded or complimented. These misunderstandings added layers of stress, creating moments of isolation that no amount of camaraderie could fully erase. By the end of the first week, they were sweating under the relentless hum of the factory. Their hands bore blisters, their backs ached, and their minds raced to keep up with both the machinery and the social navigation required to survive in this new world. Yet despite every mistake and misunderstanding, small victories began to appear. Marianne successfully completed her first full assembly run without supervision, and Anna earned a nod of approval from a skeptical foreman. Lucy's presence remained constant, a bridge between the old world and the new. She reminded them, gently but firmly, that mistakes were part of learning, that every worker in the factory had stumbled at first. Her reassurance gave the women a fragile confidence, the understanding that competence would come with time, patience, and relentless effort. Evenings were filled with quiet reflection. The women sat together in their dormitory, scrubbing their hands raw, nursing blisters, and sharing both triumphs and failures. "I never thought I'd find purpose in a factory," Marianne admitted one night, her voice trembling. "But maybe this is what survival looks like now." The days blended into a rhythm of repetition and growth. Each machine mastered, each quota met, each cultural nuance understood was a small reclamation of dignity. Still, the factory demanded more than skill. It demanded resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to navigate a world that had never expected them to exist outside captivity. By the time the sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows across the factory floor, the women realized they were beginning to belong, but only just. Every challenge surmounted was a small triumph. Yet new obstacles waited around every corner, and the city, its factories, streets, and people offered both promise and peril. Marianne wiped the sweat from her brow and looked at her companions. They were no longer just survivors of a war-torn Europe. They were apprentices in a new kind of struggle, one where success meant proving themselves in a world that had offered them freedom, but not yet acceptance. And with the next morning would come new machines, new supervisors, and new tests of their strength and resilience. A journey that was only just beginning. The factory hummed with relentless intensity, but the pace had grown heavier now. Production quotas had doubled, and the shortage of seasoned workers meant that Marianne and the other women were no longer novices. They were expected to keep up with men and women who had spent years mastering the machines. Every missed beat, every faltering motion drew sharp looks from supervisors, their silent scrutiny weighing as heavily as the iron and steel they handled. Marianne wiped her brow and tried to steady her trembling hands. The gears in the stamping press clicked with precision, unforgiving of any lapse. Her mind wandered, as it often did, to memories she could not shake, the biting cold of the camp, the barbed wire slicing the horizon, the nights of hunger and fear. Even here, in the supposed safety of New York, those ghosts followed her, making her heart race and her focus waver. Tension in the factory had begun to mount. Rumors whispered through the assembly lines, thin threads of suspicion twisting reality. Some co-workers questioned the loyalty of the foreign women. Are they really committed to the war effort? Someone muttered in a corner, or just here for the pay? The words struck like knives, invisible yet cutting deep. Marianne exchanged a glance with Anna, who shrugged helplessly, both of them understanding that suspicion, not malice, had become another obstacle to endure. And then came the incident. A machine near the end of the line shuddered violently, sparks flying as it jammed unexpectedly. Workers froze. Marianne's heart leapt into her throat as supervisors barked orders to shut it down. She and Anna worked side by side, trying to follow the frantic instructions, but panic threatened to overtake them. The factory floor smelled of burned metal and smoke, a sharp reminder that mistakes here could have consequences far greater than a reprimand. Lucy appeared beside them, calm but decisive. "Step back! Let it reset before touching anything," she shouted over the clatter. Marianne obeyed, feeling the tension knotting in her stomach. Moments stretched like hours, every second charged with the possibility of injury or disaster. Finally, with a hiss and a clank, the machine calmed, and the supervisors examined the damage. The near crisis passed, leaving the women shaken but unharmed. Yet the incident lingered in their minds, a reminder of how easily one misstep could spiral into chaos. Alongside these external challenges, the internal struggles gnawed at them. Memories of captivity resurfaced in quiet moments, triggered by the shrill whistle of a factory alarm or the sharp bark of a supervisor. Marianne found herself waking in the night, trembling, convinced that barbed wire fences and guards were just beyond her dormitory walls. Anna, too, struggled, often staring blankly at the walls, haunted by faces lost to the war, friends who would never see New York, never experience this fragile taste of freedom. Small acts of sabotage or mischief, perhaps accidental, further heightened tension. Tools misplaced, minor defects in assembly, whispered jokes in a foreign tongue, all became potential sparks of suspicion. The women worked harder to prove their dedication, moving faster, checking their work twice, speaking cautiously with co-workers to avoid misunderstandings. The weight of proving themselves pressed on them like a physical burden, adding to fatigue, stress, and anxiety. Yet, even amidst the stress and near disasters, tiny victories emerged. Marianne completed a flawless assembly run, despite the lingering fear from the morning incident. Anna successfully assisted a struggling co-worker, earning a quiet nod from a foreman. These moments were fleeting but vital, glimmers of reassurance that they were capable, that they could navigate both machinery and suspicion. By the end of the day, the women collapsed into their dormitory bunks, exhausted but determined. The emotional toll was heavier than the physical labor, each memory of captivity a shadow stretching over their present. But in whispered conversations and quiet laughter shared after long shifts, they found resilience. They reminded one another that survival had always required more than endurance. It demanded courage, adaptability, and vigilance in the face of uncertainty. Marianne stared out the window at the sprawling city lights, their glow reflecting off the river and buildings, a reminder that freedom came with expectations, challenges, and responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring new machines, new quotas, and perhaps new crises. But they had faced fear before, and though the stakes were different, the spirit of survival remained, and somewhere in the shadows of the factory, amidst the hum of gears and the rhythmic stamping of steel, the women understood that New York was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield of a different kind, and every day would test their courage, skill, and resolve. The question lingered in their minds. Could they not only survive, but thrive in this unyielding new world? Weeks turned into months, and the factory floor no longer felt like a foreign battlefield to Marianne and the women. Each day, they moved with growing confidence, their hands steady on the machines, their eyes alert to the rhythm of production. Mistakes became rare, and when they occurred, they were minor, corrected quickly with a skill that had once seemed impossible. Supervisors who had once watched them with skepticism now offered nods of approval, and co-workers who had whispered doubts now sought advice and collaboration. Respect, once out of reach, was beginning to take root. Marianne felt it most in quiet moments, when the machinery hummed like a heartbeat beneath her hands. She could anticipate the movements of the presses, the flow of parts, and the timing required to keep pace. Anna, who had once struggled with English idioms and unfamiliar tools, now guided new workers, translating instructions, demonstrating techniques, and offering encouragement. Lucy, their mentor, watched with pride, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips as the women she had helped lift now stood strong on their own. Independence came in subtle but meaningful ways. For the first time, Marianne handled her own pay, counting bills with careful precision, feeling the empowering weight of earning her own way. Letters home became a treasured ritual. She wrote to her family in fragments, trying to convey not just survival, but achievement, a sense of dignity regained. "We work hard," she wrote, "but we are learning, contributing, and we are free." Each envelope, sealed and sent across the ocean, carried a fragment of hope, a proof that they were no longer prisoners in body or spirit. Even small public acknowledgments added to their growing confidence. Anna received praise for her meticulous inspection work. Marianne's name was mentioned in a brief company newsletter, recognizing her efficiency on the line. For women who had spent years stripped of autonomy, these moments felt monumental. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about being seen, being valued, being capable in a world that had once seemed impossibly vast and alien. Yet personal growth was not only measured in accolades or paychecks. It was in the quiet moments of choice, deciding how to spend their evenings, sharing meals with co-workers, laughing over mistakes, and feeling the subtle but undeniable pride of a job well done. They began to dream again, of futures beyond the factory, of opportunities that had been denied for so long. They discovered that the strength honed in captivity could be redirected toward creation, toward building instead of merely enduring. The factory, once a place of anxiety and fear, now became a stage for triumph. Marianne noticed how her movements had become precise, her instincts sharp, her confidence radiating even in small gestures. Anna's translations were no longer halting but fluid. She could bridge gaps between co-workers and ease tensions with her growing authority. Even Lucy, who had guided them from the start, admitted with a rare laugh that they had surpassed the skills she had imagined they could achieve in so short a time. The women celebrated privately in their dormitory, sharing chocolates, stories, and small tokens of recognition. Each gesture, each word of encouragement reinforced the idea that they had earned their place. They had transformed from outsiders, viewed with suspicion and doubt, into valued contributors, capable of independence, mastery, and purpose. The emotional payoff was profound. Marianne gazed out at the city skyline one evening, the lights reflecting off the river, and felt a surge of gratitude and pride. She had survived horrors beyond comprehension, navigated a world unfamiliar and demanding, and emerged competent, confident, and respected. The journey had been harrowing, filled with doubts and shadows, yet here she was, standing tall in the heart of a city that had once seemed impossibly vast. For the first time in years, the women felt fully integrated into their new society. Not just present, but participants, recognized and valued. The hard work, the perseverance, the courage to face each new day had paid off. Triumph was no longer a distant dream. It was tangible, earned with every blistered hand, every cautious step, every ounce of resilience that had carried them from captivity to competence. And as the factory quieted for the night, Marianne allowed herself a rare smile, one that carried the weight of fear, hope, struggle, and now undeniable victory. They had arrived at a turning point in their lives. Freedom was no longer a fragile promise. It was being lived, felt, and celebrated, one hard-won day at a time. Evenings in the dormitory were quieter now. The constant hum of factory machinery had faded into memory, replaced by the soft murmur of voices sharing stories, letters, and the rare laughter that came easy only among those who had endured the unimaginable together. Marianne sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at the small envelope she had just received from home. The handwriting was familiar, the words tentative yet filled with relief. She traced each letter with her finger, thinking of the family who had worried for her every day, wondering if she would ever return. The journey from the barbed wire camps of Europe to the bustling streets of New York had been surreal. Freedom had arrived wrapped in the unfamiliar, in a city whose energy both exhilarated and overwhelmed. The factories that had seemed like machines of oppression at first were now symbols of their resilience, places where every task completed, every quota met, had been a reclaiming of dignity stolen for so long. But with freedom came reflection, sometimes bitter, sometimes tender. Marianne's thoughts often drifted back to her companions left behind, the friends who had not survived, the laughter and tears shared in the harshest conditions, now memories tinged with sorrow. Anna too felt the weight of loss. On quiet nights, she would linger by the window, imagining faces she would never see again, whispering their names softly into the darkness. These memories, painful as they were, had shaped their strength, giving context to the triumphs now celebrated in the factory halls and dormitories. Yet the challenges of adaptation continued. American society was welcoming in some ways, yet subtly complicated in others. Language barriers still caused small misunderstandings, and cultural norms, once foreign, required constant attention. Simple gestures, knowing when to nod, when to speak, or how to respond, were exercises in vigilance. Some women felt isolated in moments when homesickness collided with the demands of work, leaving them unsure whether they belonged in this strange, vibrant world. Even so, the bonds they had formed in captivity persisted and strengthened. They relied on one another for guidance, encouragement, and understanding. Marianne could sense Anna's quiet support before it was spoken. Lucy's laughter could lift the heaviest of moods in a matter of seconds. These connections were more than friendships. They were lifelines, a network of survival woven from shared experience, trust, and an understanding deeper than any words could convey. In these bonds, they discovered that freedom did not have to be lonely, that solidarity could be a sanctuary just as powerful as any walls or fences had ever been. Every day brought small victories in assimilation, a fluently spoken sentence, an invitation to a social gathering, a nod of respect from a supervisor or co-worker. Each success reminded them that survival had evolved into something greater: adaptation, contribution, and eventually a tentative belonging. Yet even in these triumphs, the women acknowledged the invisible scars, the tremors of fear that flared unexpectedly, the nightmares of camp life that returned unbidden in the dead of night. Marianne often reflected on the irony of it all. Once prisoners, bound by fear and circumstance, they had fought not only to escape captivity, but to master the freedom they had won. And in doing so, they discovered resilience they had never known, courage born not from choice, but from necessity. The city around them, with its streets, lights, and roaring factories, became both a challenge and a testament to their journey. They had not only survived, they had grown, adapted, and begun to thrive. As the dormitory settled into quiet, Marianne and the others exchanged whispered words of encouragement and comfort. They spoke of letters sent and received, of accomplishments celebrated in small circles, of dreams now possible for the first time in years. They laughed softly at remembered mistakes and missteps on the factory floor, grateful for the camaraderie that had carried them through the harshest days. In the midst of reflection, a profound understanding took hold. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains. It was the ability to move, to work, to speak, to live in a world that demanded courage and resilience at every turn. They had survived captivity and suspicion, labor and scrutiny, loss and uncertainty. Now they were learning to live fully, to embrace their hard-earned independence, and to honor the bonds that had carried them through darkness into light. And as Marianne looked out over the city, the lights twinkling like distant stars, she realized that while the journey had been long and harrowing, they were no longer just survivors. They were women who had claimed their place in the world, together, unbroken and ready to face whatever came next. Years passed, yet the echoes of those early days in New York factories lingered in the memories of Marianne and the women who had arrived as uncertain, weary POWs. Their presence had not only filled a desperate need in wartime industry, but had quietly reshaped the way communities and workplaces viewed foreign labor and female resilience. They had shown that courage, skill, and determination could transcend borders, language, and preconceived notions. The machines they had mastered, the quotas they had met, and the innovations they had contributed became more than wartime production. They became symbols of empowerment, proof that women could excel in roles once reserved for men. Marianne reflected on the long journey from the frozen barracks of Europe to the bustling floors of factories that hummed with purpose and possibility. Each woman carried her own story of survival, yet together they had formed a tapestry of courage. Enna, who had once struggled with language and confidence, became a respected trainer and mediator on the factory floor. Lucy, who had guided them at the start, now watched with quiet pride as a new generation of workers learned not just machinery, but resilience, dedication, and the power of community. Each small victory, each success, rippled outward, affecting the lives of families, co-workers, and even the broader perception of what women could achieve during wartime. Recognition came in subtle and formal ways alike. Letters of commendation, newspaper articles highlighting female contributions, and occasional ceremonies honoring factory achievements reminded them that their efforts mattered. But beyond these acknowledgments, the true impact lay in the transformations they had undergone, from frightened, uncertain survivors to skilled, independent women capable of shaping their destinies. They had reclaimed control over lives that had once been defined by captivity and fear, and in doing so, they had quietly inspired those around them. One crisp autumn afternoon, Marianne returned to the old factory for a reunion organized by former co-workers and supervisors. The familiar clamor of machinery had long been replaced by quiet nostalgia. But as she stepped through the doors, the memories came rushing back. The first days of uncertainty, the near crises, the friendships forged under pressure, the painstaking mastery of each machine. She spotted Anna across the room, and their eyes met, reflecting the years, the hardships, and the triumphs they had shared. Lucy greeted them both with a warm embrace, laughter carrying the weight of pride and relief. They stood together, women who had once been prisoners, now celebrated for their resilience, skill, and contributions. The room seemed to hum with history, a silent acknowledgement that every blistered hand, every long hour, every ounce of courage had mattered. In that moment, they were not just survivors, they were pioneers, role models, and living reminders that strength could be forged from the harshest of experiences. Marianne thought of the letters she had sent home, the whispered conversations in the dormitory, and the lessons learned on the factory floor. All of it had led to this, a recognition not only of work performed, but of lives transformed. They had endured, adapted, and thrived, and the legacy of their determination would ripple far beyond those wartime years. As the reunion drew to a close, the women stepped outside, looking out over the skyline of New York City, the same city that had once seemed overwhelming, distant, and impossible. Now it felt like a witness to their triumph, a silent companion to their courage. Marianne allowed herself a final deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey behind her and the promise of the future ahead. Freedom had begun as a fragile hope, grown into achievement, and now rested as a legacy of resilience, courage, and empowerment, an enduring testament to the extraordinary women who had transformed both their lives and the world around them.